Workshop is here! Now, here is workshop! Hey guys, I am Dr. Katie Ailes from I'm Loud Productions, and in today's workshop, I'm going to teach you how to write a palindrome poem. This is a tricky but amazing form of poetry, which line by line reads the same forwards and backwards. In this workshop, I'll break down how palindrome poetry works, I'll show you some examples of variations on the form, and I'll lead you step by step through how to write a palindrome poem yourself. Just like the rest of the workshops in our Return to Form series, there are two different ways of watching. The first approach is to take this workshop and write along. In that approach, whenever you see a screen with a step on it, like this, pause the video at that screen, do whatever the step says, do some writing, and then when you're ready to move on with the workshop, hit play again. The second approach is just to watch this video all the way through without pausing to get a sense of how palindrome poems work, and then later to write your own in your own time. Do whatever approach works best for you. All that you need to take this workshop is something to write with and something to write on, so pen and paper, a computer, tablet, whatever you got. I'll be showing you how I wrote my example poem using a computer, but palindrome poetry is just as simple to write using pen and paper, so use whatever material you're most comfortable with. This workshop, alongside the rest of our Return to Form series, is supported by the National Lottery through Creative Scotland. Massive thanks to them for making this possible. You can see all of the videos in this project through the playlist linked up there in the eye. Go we here? Okay, here we go. First things first, what exactly is palindrome poetry? Well, it's poetry that functions as a palindrome. So, what exactly is a palindrome? Generally speaking, a palindrome is a piece of text that reads the same forwards and backwards. A palindrome can work on the level of the individual letter, the word, or the line. An example of a palindrome in which each letter is the same forwards and backwards is the word race car. You could flip it around and it's still the same word. It hinges on the letter E. Because this kind of palindrome works on the level of the individual letter, this is known as a letter unit or character unit palindrome. Moving up from letters to words, an example of a sentence which is a palindrome on the word level is, "Can I write forwards and backwards and forwards? Right, I can." As you can see, each word is mirrored on the other side, with the word backwards acting as the hinge between the first and second sections. This is known as a word unit palindrome. And as you can see, guys, this is a perfect word unit palindrome when spoken aloud, but of course there's a little cheat in there. The homophone right is used with two different spellings and meanings. Usually homophones aren't used in palindrome poetry, but if you want to get a little clever, you could include one in yours. As always, I am here for playful linguistic trickery. Next, we have line unit palindromes, in which it's not the individual letter, not the individual word, but the entire line which is mirrored. Here's a short example. You love him because he is kind. And of course, he is kind because you love him. As you can see, here the line "and of course" acts as the hinge of the palindrome, and each other line is mirrored across that hinge. That is how most palindrome poetry works, as line unit palindromes, and it's the kind that we're going to be tackling in today's workshop. You can also write word unit and even letter unit palindrome poetry, but as I'm sure you can imagine, the smaller the unit is, the harder the poem is to write. I'll show you now in more detail how line unit palindrome poems work using the gorgeous palindrome poem that Robin Lamball wrote for this season of Return to Form. You can watch our video featuring this palindrome poem alongside a stunning palindrome poem by Jasmine Gardosi through the link up there in the eye. Robin's poem brilliantly uses the palindrome form to talk about the so-called immortal jellyfish. This is a fascinating species which, when faced with danger, can revert to an earlier developmental stage and effectively become young again. Here, I've highlighted section A with the poem running forwards in red, I've highlighted the hinge in yellow, and I've highlighted section B where the poem runs backwards in blue. I've also numbered the lines so that the mirrored lines correspond to each other. So as you can see here, we have line 27A and line 27B, and both are variations on the same line. In this poem, section A covers the immortal jellyfish's development. Then, the hinge of the poem occurs at line 28, if it triggered at your worst moment. That line about trauma works on the poem just like trauma works on the immortal jellyfish. It reverses its development. The poem then goes backwards and describes the jellyfish reverse developing, basically getting younger. This is beyond cool, and it's such a brilliant example of poetic form going hand in hand with poetic meaning, form reinforcing function. How awesome is that? As Robin's poem demonstrates, palindrome poetry is a fantastic form to use for material about regeneration, returning, mirroring. In my workshop on the villanelle, I talk about how, because of their line repetition, villanelles are often used to describe something circular, something that cycles or gets stuck in a loop. The same thing is true for palindrome poetry. Because the entire poem goes forward, then backward, it's a great poetic form to use to talk about something that renews or reverses or can be seen through a different light. This is obviously a tricky form of poetry to write. Goodness knows it's hard enough to write a poem that makes sense going one way, let alone it being reversible. But not to worry, I'm going to point out now some features that make it a little bit simpler and some options for flexibility here. First of all, the mirroring is challenging, but luckily it is the only restriction that you need to follow. The lines of your palindrome poem can be however long or short you want them to be, and there is absolutely no requirement to use rhyme or meter or any particular stanza structure here. Secondly, although the text of a palindrome poem has to be the same in sections A and B, the punctuation can change. You can remove, add, or move periods, commas, question marks. You can change capitalization. You can add quotation marks to create dialogue, etc. This allows the same language to be used in different contexts in each section, which gives you as the poet more options and makes the poem more engaging for the reader or listener. For example, take lines 20 to 23 of Robin's poem. In section A, they read, "You find yourself wanting stability. Is here the place you can abandon your brainlessly glassy striving?" However, when that same material is reversed and differently punctuated in section B, it reads, "You, brainlessly glassy, striving, you can abandon your wanting. Stability is here, the place you find yourself in." These alterations to punctuation, in combination with the line reversal, totally change the meaning. I just think this is so cool, and it's a fantastic tool to take advantage of when you're composing palindrome poetry. And of course, how your poem is punctuated goes hand in hand with how it's performed. You can perform the material in sections A and B with totally different intonations, emphases, etc. A couple more things to note about this version of the form. So you could choose to include your title in your palindrome, in which case it functions like the first line of your poem. That is what Jasmine Gardosi does in their poem Being Me. That line is both the title of the poem and the final line of the poem. Or you could just choose to keep your title separate from the palindrome, which is what Robin did in Immortal Jellyfish. Totally up to you. Another option is that you could choose not to include a hinge line. In that case, you would end section A and then immediately reverse the poem and start going backwards into section B. And in that case, you'll have those two repeating lines back to back. For an example of that approach, I've linked in the video description to Natasha Trethewey's gorgeous poem Myth. It is totally up to you guys whether or not you include that Hinge line. A final option here. So some poets, when publishing their line unit palindrome poems, choose to just publish section A and then have a line at the end saying, "Now read it backwards." That can work and it adds a bit of novelty to the form, but personally I prefer including both section A, the optional hinge, and section B when putting out palindrome poems. And that's because, as I noted before, you can alter the punctuation in each section to give yourself more options. But if you're only publishing section A, you only have one option for how that section is punctuated. So really, I think it's best to show both section A and section B whenever you're putting out your palindrome poem in print. All right, guys, so that is how the line unit palindrome poem works. Palindrome poetry in general is fairly rare, fairly underused, but I think that the line unit palindrome poem is probably the most common version of this form of poetry. In today's workshop, we're going to be writing a specific kind of line unit palindrome poetry, which I call the opposition palindrome, and I'm going to show you how it works now. This is a super cool approach where in the first section, the poem argues one thing, and then after the hinge, the poem argues the opposite perspective. There have been several poems that have gone viral recently using this approach, including Jonathan Reed's Lost Generation, and I've linked to them in the description below. I'll demonstrate for you guys how this version of line unit palindrome poetry works using a completely ridiculous example that I wrote. Emus are mythical creatures, so I'll never believe that emus are real. Ultimately, emus could never exist. The idea is preposterous that there are giant land-bound birds. However, there are giant land-bound birds. The idea is preposterous that emus could never exist. Ultimately, emus are real, so I'll never believe that emus are mythical creatures. Haha! Poetry! How nifty is that? So, as you can see, section A argues one perspective, that emus are not real. Then, after the hinge, section B argues the opposite perspective, that emus are real. Obviously, this is a silly example, but these pieces can be quite moving, and they're fantastic demonstrations of the potential power of palindrome poetry. Alliteration, ooh! Palindrome poetry that works in this way follows a code, a key, and it's actually fairly simple to use once you understand it. We're going to be using this key to write our own palindrome poems, so I'll briefly show you how it works now. Let's just focus on section A here. So there are two arguments in this poem. The emus are fake, which we're calling argument X, and the emus are real, which we're calling argument Y. The first thing to notice is that every other line puts forth an argument, and they alternate. Line 1 states argument X, line 3 states argument Y, and back and forth until the hinge at line 8. The rest of the lines in the poem are connective statements that don't carry any information relevant to the poem. They're not about emus, but they state belief or disbelief, and they alternate between these statements. So lines 2 and 6 are what I've termed negative connectors. So I'll never believe that, and the idea is preposterous that. But line 4 is a positive connector because it carries belief in the statement following it. Ultimately, you could write any variations on these negative and positive connectors and the poem would still work. So line 4 could be, "What I mean is," or "I firmly believe that," etc. So that is the key for writing line unit opposition palindrome poems. Argument X, negative connector, argument Y, positive connector, and repeat until the hinge. As you can see, when we reverse the order of the lines for section B and alter the punctuation so that it works, now section B conveys the opposite perspective from section A. It believes in argument Y, that emus are real. You can start with either perspective, either argument, depending on the order that you want them in your poem. So as I said, guys, this is the key that we're going to be using to create our own line unit opposition palindrome poems. There can be downsides to using such a highly structured approach to poetry. For instance, it can be hard to find a natural flow to it, a sense of ease. But in my opinion, this is the best place to start when learning to write palindrome poetry. Once you've learned this key, once you've mastered this approach, you'll be much more prepared to try writing in other forms of palindromic poetry. And I have just one more very quick example of another way of using palindromes in poetry before we get to writing our own. Line unit palindrome poems mirroring across a central horizontal hinge ain't all that's out there. Let me show you Rita Dove's poem Mirror. As you can see, this poem is mirrored across a central blank column, rather than being mirrored horizontally at a hinge. If you're used to contrapuntal poetry, you might be tempted to read it across that central column. You can't do that here, you just read it down the two columns. And as you can see, rather than being a line unit palindrome, this is a word unit palindrome. Each word is mirrored across that central column. These left and right poem sections mirror each other both literally, in terms of their palindromic nature, and in terms of their meaning. This is a poem about looking in the mirror, about the changes to faces due to age and makeup, about evolving identity. Again here, form reinforces function. It is so cool. Guys, these examples that I've given you are just a taste of the potential of palindrome poetry. There are so many ways of innovating in this form, depending on whether you're using letter, word, or line unit, and where you place your mirror or your hinge. But that's enough examples for now. Let's actually get down to it, and let's start writing our very own palindrome poems. So as I said, in this workshop, I'm going to lead you guys through how to write opposition line unit palindrome poems, like the emu example, but hopefully better. This is obviously a tricky form, even though we're using a key, so be patient with yourself, save your drafts, and knock that critic off your shoulder. They're not welcome here. Let's go have fun. First things first, we gotta choose a subject for our poem. Because we're writing opposition palindrome poems, your subject needs to be something with two sides to it. This could be two opposing sides of a debate, whether it's a weighty political matter or something more lighthearted, like whether Marmite is good or bad. It might be a matter of belief, like I believe people are fundamentally good, or I believe people are fundamentally bad. Or, whether or not emus are real. Or it might be two differing perspectives, like I miss her or I'm better off without her. For my example palindrome poem, I've chosen to juxtapose two seasons, summer and winter, and make the poem about preferring heat or cold. So for this first step of the workshop, take some time now and choose the subject of your poem, ensuring that it's something with two sides to it. Go for it. Now that you've chosen your subject, it is time to start drafting material. As usual, we're not going to begin by writing straight into the key. Instead, we're going to warm up our brains and generate a lot of material up front by free writing. We're going to do a separate free write for each of the two sides that you've chosen. I'll show you here. For my example poem, that meant free writing about loving winter, then free writing about loving summer. I set a timer for 5 minutes for each free write, and I went for it. And as usual with the free write, knock the critic off your shoulder. Do not worry about spelling or if it makes any sense, just get words down on the page. And as you're free writing, really lean into the 5 senses. Be descriptive, use vivid language, no matter what your topic is. This will help the piece to feel less formulaic and more, like a poem. All right, guys, go for it now and free write for 5 minutes on each side of your subject. Great. So the next step in the workshop is to draft some connecting material. As we saw in my emu example, these are general phrases, not specifically about your subject, that express preference or dislike, belief or disbelief. The kinds of connective phrases that you need to draft here will depend in part on the subject that you've chosen. Let me explain. My palindrome poem is about preference, whether you prefer winter or summer, cold or heat. So I'm drafting both positive and negative phrases about preference and desire. However, your palindrome poem might be about belief, like, I believe people are good, I believe Marmite is bad. If that's the case, draft your positive and negative connective phrases around belief, like, I have faith that, or how could anyone think that, etc. These all need to be partial phrases so that they'll work to connect the lines of your poem. I love blank, I need blank, blank is the best, etc. Okay guys, go ahead now and draft some connective phrases that you might be able to use in your palindrome poem. This doesn't need to be a long list, you're just generating some material that'll make life a little bit easier later on. Go for it. All right, now that we have plenty of material drafted, it's time to start working that material into an actual palindrome poem using our key. And in the next couple of steps, I'll show you how to do that. First, of course, we need to write out the key. Since I'm drafting my palindrome poem on a computer, I created a table showing the key, and I've actually linked in the description to the template version of this Google Doc that you guys are more than welcome to download and use yourselves. As you can see, this key has 12 lines in it, 11 palindromic lines plus a hinge, for a total poem length of 23 lines. Of course, you can add or delete lines depending on however long or short you want your palindrome poem to be. Just ensure that you're following the pattern laid out in the key. Go ahead now, guys, and write out your key, whether that means downloading the template that I've linked to in the description, or creating your own key on the computer, or writing it out on paper. Go for it. For this next step, we need to choose which side of your subject, which perspective you want to argue in section A, and which perspective you want to argue in section B. Usually with this type of poetry, the perspective that you end with, that you argue in section B, is seen as the one that you actually agree with or want to emphasize. So for me, I actually prefer winter, so I'm going to argue that perspective in section B. In terms of our key, that means that preferring winter is my argument Y, and preferring summer is my argument X. Just to keep it clear for myself, I'm adding that information into the key. So I'm replacing argument Y with pro-winter, and replacing argument X with pro-summer. Go ahead now and choose the order in which you want the two sides of your subject to be argued, and make a note of that in your key. That's all the setup done. Now we just get to start filling in the key. Again, the helpful thing is that we've already drafted plenty of material for this, so we are not starting from scratch. I'll show you now how I filled in the key using my example poem, and this can get a little bit tricky, so bear with me. To come up with the lines for this palindrome poem, we're basically going to pan for gold in real time. So I just went through my free write looking for material that would work. And I began by filling in the pro-summer lines on my key. One thing that I actually realized here is that because my poem is about preference rather than belief, I actually needed these descriptive lines about summer and winter to be kind of neutral, because they would need to be things that could be seen as good or bad depending on each reading of the poem. It's a little bit simpler for palindrome poems based on belief, like the emu example, as you straight up lay out your arguments in those and then say, I believe this, or I don't believe that. So if your palindrome poem is based in preference or desire, fill in these argument X and argument Y lines with statements about your two sides that can be perceived either way. For example, lazing all day in blazing heat isn't inherently good or bad. It's just a feature of summer, and whether you like that or not is a matter of preference. However, the wonderful scent of baking cookies is an inherently positive statement, so I wouldn't be able to twist that in the reverse reading. I know that might be a bit confusing, guys. It took me a lot of trial and error to work that one out. If you're feeling a little bit lost, just fill in those statements on your map using your free write, and then if it doesn't work, you can always change it later. And as you can see, I'm just filling in the lines in section A for now, not their corresponding lines in section B. I'll do that later once I'm happy with section A. The next stage is to fill in the connecting lines. I relied on my bank of lines here, and for the first one I wrote, "It's much better than." I read those 3 lines both ways, forwards and backwards, and it works, depending on how it's punctuated in each direction. For the next connector, I wrote, "I crave the feeling of." And here I had to be careful and ensure that both of the lines around it described a feeling. Otherwise, that connector wouldn't work. Then, when I was drafting the next connector, I realized that both of the lines around it described situations of warmth, baking far from the shade, and bundling under blankets and scarves. I needed a negative connector here, and since these lines were actually similar in what they described, I used a specific one. So I wrote, "Not the stifling sensation of." For my last 2 connectors, I wrote, "Nothing calms me like," and "I am drowned out by." And I'm not adding punctuation yet, and these phrases will almost definitely need to be tinkered with, but at this point we are just filling in the first draft of the key. Okay guys, take as long as you need for this step and fill in section A of the key. Rely on the material that you've free-written and your bank of connective phrases. Don't worry about punctuation and don't worry about making it gorgeous. At this point, we are just drafting. Go for it. Fab! The next step in filling in our key is to add a hinge. There's a ton of flexibility here because the hinge is the only line in a palindrome poem which isn't repeated. It only occurs once. It could be a single word, or a complete sentence, or part of sentences in section A and or section B. And you might want to use your hinge to draw attention to the change in perspective coming in section B. So to make it something like however, or on the other hand. That is the strategy that I used for my example poem. I was thinking about how the grass is always greener when it comes to weather. When it's hot, we want it cold. When it's cold, we want it hot. So for my hinge, I wrote, "But I am as fickle as the seasons. In summer, I miss the," and this sets up the twist in perspective nicely. Your hinge doesn't need to specifically mention the subject of your poem, but I think it's nice to work it in if it's relevant. It's worth remembering at this point that using a hinge is optional. If you would prefer that your poem mirror in on itself without that connecting line, that's totally fine. I would encourage you to try drafting a few hinge lines, see what you like, and then decide whether or not using a hinge makes sense for your palindrome poem. Go for it. Hooray! That is all of the text written for this draft of your palindrome poem. Nice and easy step now, guys. We're just going to copy over every line in section A to its corresponding line in section B. So I just copied and pasted all my lines from section A into section B, again not fussing about punctuation yet, just ensuring that everything is in the right place. Your turn now. Go ahead and copy over every line in section A into the corresponding place in section B. Guys, that is your full draft of your palindrome poem. You are smashing it! The final step in writing palindrome poetry and in this workshop is to add punctuation to your palindrome poem and to edit it. I'll show you how I did that now, and I'll give you some guidance. Normally, I encourage you to read your poem aloud as the final step of the workshop. In this case, though, you really need to be actively reading your palindrome poem draft aloud as you're editing it. That makes it so much easier to gauge whether the poem makes sense and whether it flows in both directions. And reading it aloud, you'll pause naturally in certain places, and that will indicate to you where the punctuation needs to go in each section. So reading my draft aloud was the first step that I took when editing. Here's what that sounds like. Lazing all day in blazing heat. It's much better than frosty air nipping at your fingertips. I crave the feeling of baking far from the shade, not the stifling sensation of bundling under blankets and scarves. Nothing calms me like the sun drumming down on my face. I am drowned out by snow silencing all sound. But I am fickle as the seasons. In summer, I miss the snow silencing all sound. I am drowned out by the sun drumming down on my face. Nothing calms me like bundling under blankets and scarves, not the stifling sensation of baking far from the shade. I crave the feeling of frosty air nipping at your fingers. It's much better than lazing all day in blazing heat. From reading it aloud, I noticed a couple of things. First, I realized that I used me and my for most of the poem, but you for lines 3A and 3B, so I changed those to my in those lines to make it more consistent. Secondly, I realized that the lines were pretty disconnected, so I needed to add more transitional words and punctuation to help the poem flow. I started at the top. This first line bugged me. I wanted it to be an exclamation, to laze all day in blazing heat. But when I scrolled down to the bottom of the poem, I saw that that wouldn't really work for the corresponding line. It's much better than to laze all day in blazing heat is kind of funky, so I'm making it an exclamation as it is in that first line. It's a little bit grammatically goofy, but hey-ho, it's poetry. From there, I went through the draft punctuating it based on where I paused as I read it aloud. And in one case, I added a word. So in lines 9A and 9B, I wanted the lines to flow into each other more smoothly, so I added "and" at the ends of both lines, double checking before I did so that the poem would still work in both directions. So now take some time to read this draft of your palindrome poem aloud and then go through the piece editing the punctuation and, if you feel it's necessary, altering the wording. Just remember that the punctuation can change from section A to section B, but the wording can't. Go for it. Amazing! Guys, you have written a palindrome poem! Take that around all the open mics and astonish the audiences with your prowess. As I've said throughout the workshop, there are so many different fantastic approaches to palindrome poetry, and I really hope that you'll explore all of them, but I hope that today's workshop got you started on that journey and that it was helpful for you in understanding this form. If you wrote along today and you'd be comfortable sharing what you wrote, I would absolutely love to read it. You can pop your poem in the comments or share it with us through social media. All of our handles are in the video description. And of course, if you have any questions on how to write palindrome poetry, I am more than happy to help. Just ask in the comments. The next form that we are tackling in this season of Return to Form is terza rima. This is a beautiful poetic form consisting of tercets, 3-line stanzas, with an interlocking rhyme scheme. It's been such an honor to have Joelle Taylor and Colin Bramwell writing poems in terza rima for us. Their poems will be premiering soon, and of course, I will have a workshop for you guys all about that form. If you enjoyed this video, guys, it would make a big difference if you could like it, subscribe to the channel, and ring that bell icon so that you get notified every time that we post a new video. You can directly support what we do here at I Am Loud by signing up to our Patreon for as little as £1 a month, and you get some really, really cool stuff. Who doesn't want cool stuff? Thank you so much for watching, and happy writing.